She was 8 years old, and she had been forgotten on purpose. Not lost, not separated by accident, not left behind in the confusion of a busy camp or a sudden storm. Forgotten on purpose, by a woman who had looked at a child standing in the dust of the Camino Real del Norte and made a calculation, quiet, cold, and final, and decided that the numbers did not add up in the child's favor. The wagon had rolled north without her, and Rosa Elena Vega had watched it go. She stood there long after the dust had settled, long after the sound of the wheels had faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the Sonora territory, long after there was nothing left to watch. Then her legs simply stopped holding her, the way legs do when the thing they were bracing against is finally completely gone, and she sat down in the dirt beside the trail with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around a small rag doll that she had been clutching so tightly for so long that the worn fabric had taken the shape of her grip. The doll had belonged to her mother. It was the only thing left in the world that had. Her mother had died the previous winter, a fever that came fast and went slowly, and took Maria de la Luz Vega away on a gray Tuesday morning, while Rosa sat beside the bed and held her hand, and did not fully understand what was happening until it was over, and the hand went still. Esteban Vega died on a Tuesday, the same day of the week as her mother, as if fate had a preference for Tuesdays. He held Rosa's hand at the end and said her mother's name, and Rosa held his hand back and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And then he was gone too, and she was the only Vega left in the world. Dolores had not wept at the grave. She had stood at the appropriate distance and worn the appropriate expression, and that evening she had looked at Rosa across the fire with those sharp eyes doing their quiet, cold arithmetic, and Rosa had understood, in the wordless animal way that children understand things that adults try to hide, that she was now a problem to be solved rather than a child to be loved.
She tried to be invisible. She tried to take up less space, make less noise, ask for less food, require less of everything. Children who are afraid of being discarded become very good at smallness. It is a survival skill that leaves marks. None of it was enough. 6 weeks after her father's death, on a hot afternoon in the late summer of 1867, while the rest of the traveling party was stopped for water at a creek crossing 3 miles back, Dolores had told Rosa to walk ahead on the trail and wait. Rosa had walked and waited, and the wagons had never come. Only Dolores had come, briefly, to say what she had come to say. "You are too slow," she said, not looking at the girl. "We cannot carry the weight of someone who cannot keep up." Then she had turned her horse and ridden north, and the trail had swallowed her whole, and Rosa was alone. She sat in the dirt as the sun moved lower in the sky, and the shadows of the dry scrub lengthened across the pale ground around her. The Sonoran territory in late summer is not a landscape that offers comfort. The heat does not relent even as the light fades. The land stretches in every direction with a kind of absolute indifference, red rock and gray dust, and the occasional twisted silhouette of a mesquite tree against the sky that is too large and too empty to look at for long. There is beauty in it, a spare and terrible beauty, but it is not the beauty of a place that cares whether you survive it. Rosa did not think about surviving. She was 8 years old, and her legs hurt, and she was thirsty, and her mother was dead, and her father was dead, and the woman who had replaced them had left her here to become part of the landscape. She thought about her mother's doll. She held it against her chest and looked at its mismatched button eyes and its unraveling and broaded smile, and she talked to it, very quietly, the way she had talked to it every night since her mother died, telling it things she couldn't say out loud to anyone else. She did not see the man on the ridge. She did not see him raise the brass spyglass to his eye and go still. She did not see him hold that stillness for a long moment, the way a man holds still when he is not sure what he is seeing and needs to be certain before he acts. She did not see him lower the glass and look at the sky and make the calculation that good light was running out. She did not see him wheel his horse toward the switchback trail and kick it into a run. All she heard was the hoofbeats, sudden and fast and growing louder, and pressed herself smaller against the ground the way small things do when something large is coming, not knowing yet whether the thing coming was danger or deliverance. Don Aurelio Montoya pulled his horse to a stop in a cloud of fine dust 10 feet from where she sat. He was 42 years old, and he had a face that the desert had made severe, weathered and still, with dark eyes that had learned over many years to take in information without showing much of what they made of it.
He was not a man given to impulsive gestures. He was a man who measured things carefully and acted on the measurement, and nothing in his life had ever driven him to kick a horse to a full gallop on a rocky switchback trail in fading light for any reason that wasn't absolutely certain and necessary. He swung down from the saddle in one movement, and he did something that Rosa would remember for the rest of her life. He took off his hat. He knelt down in the dirt. He looked at her the way people look at things that matter to them, with full attention, without hurry, without condescension. He was a wealthy and powerful man in that territory, and he was kneeling in the dust of the Camino Real and taking a child seriously. "What is your name?" he said. His voice was low and steady, like water running over stone. She almost didn't answer. She had learned in recent weeks to be careful with strangers, but something in that voice, something that carried no threat, no agenda, only a plain and patient waiting, reached through the fear. "Rosa," she said, "Rosa Elena Vega." He nodded, receiving the name with the gravity it deserved. "And where is your family, Rosa Elena?" She looked north. Gone. He did not ask her to explain. He did not ask what had happened, or why she was alone, or who was responsible. He simply stood, settled his hat back on his head, and held out one hand, large, weathered, entirely steady. "My name is Aurelio Montoya," he said. "My ranch is 3 miles east. There is a woman there who will give you food and a warm bed tonight. I will not leave you here." 4 words, "I will not leave." Rosa Elena Vega had heard many things from adults in the past several months. She had heard promises that dissolved, and comforts that were lies, and explanations for terrible things that were really just the terrible things dressed up in gentler language. She had learned to be skeptical of words, but she looked at the hand in front of her, and she looked at the face above the hand, and she made the decision that would change everything. She took his hand. He lifted her onto the saddle before him and turned the horse east, and as Rancho Dos Ríos came into view in the last warm light of that evening, a great white house set against the dark line of the mountains, with the twin streams of the valley catching the dying sun, and 2 rivers of gold running toward home, Rosa looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of safety, the shape of it just ahead, close enough to reach. The woman who came down the front steps of the great house and lifted Rosa down from the horse and looked into her face was Consuelo Reyes, 61 years old, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, with hands that were simultaneously the most capable and most gentle Rosa had ever encountered. Consuelo said nothing when she saw the child. She simply looked, the way people look when they recognize something they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Then she said, softly and without hesitation, "Come with me, mija. Let's get you clean and fed." That night, Rosa soaked in a copper tub of warm water while Consuelo washed her hair with careful hands and hummed a low, wordless song that Rosa did not know and somehow recognized. It was the song that mothers hum, the kind that has no words because the feeling it carries is too large for words.
Afterward, she ate warm soup and fresh tortillas and cold milk at the long kitchen table, and she ate until she was full, which had not happened in longer than she could precisely remember. And then she put her head down on her arms at that table and went to sleep, with her mother's doll pressed against her cheek. And Consuelo carried her to a small cedar-scented room and tucked her in with the gravity of someone performing something sacred. Consuelo stood in that doorway for a long time after. She had lost her own daughter, Elena, to a fever 30 years ago, had carried that loss in silence ever since, had never spoken of it to anyone, because grief of that particular kind does not have a shelf life and does not respond well to being discussed. She stood and watched this sleeping child and felt that old grief move through her like a tide, and she did not stop it, because you cannot stop it, and it is better not to try. She let it pass, and when it passed, something was different on the other side of it. Something had shifted, subtle and permanent, the way the landscape shifts after a flood, the same ground but rearranged. She closed the door gently and went to find Don Aurelio on the front porch, where he sat as he always sat in the evenings, hat on the railing, coffee cooling in his hands, looking out at the dark plain with the steady, patient gaze of a man who has made a habit of distance. He was a man who had loved deeply once. Isabel Fuentes, the daughter of a Santa Rosa merchant family, had brought warmth and music and a particular quality of light to this house for 8 years. Then she had died in childbirth. Their son, Miguel, had lived less than 2 days. That had been 10 years ago, and Aurelio Montoya had continued, had ridden his fence lines and overseen his cattle and paid his workers and managed his affairs with the gruff, competent decency that his vaqueros respected and his rivals feared. But he had continued the way a house continues when the people who made it a home are gone, still standing, all the furniture in place, empty in the ways that matter. Consuelo sat beside him in the dark, and they were quiet together for a while, as they had been quiet together for 23 years, two people who understood each other through long familiarity without requiring much language. "She will need more than a few nights," Consuelo said. "I know," he said.
6 weeks passed. They were weeks of gradual, incremental miracle. Rosa learned the kitchen alongside Consuelo, learned the library, a high-ceilinged room that she had stood in the doorway of one morning with an expression of such pure astonishment that Aurelio, who had come to find her, had stopped and stayed silent rather than interrupt something that seemed important. She had asked if she could read the books. "All of them," he said, "if you have the patience." She did. She had extraordinary patience. She learned to ride Mariposa, the golden mare in the south paddock, with Aurelio walking beside her through the first awkward lessons, and then standing at the fence, watching as she grew more certain, her small, straight back and steady hands, her laughter when the horse moved into a trot, genuine, unguarded, the laugh of a child who has remembered how. Aurelio stood at that fence, and the ice in his chest moved. Not melted, not yet, but moved. And then one morning a buggy arrived with an official seal on its door, and everything that had been quietly building was suddenly under threat. Señorita Carmen Vidal of the Sociedad de Protección a la Infancia was a tall woman in gray with the bearing of someone who has been given authority and has mistaken it for righteousness. Behind her came Ramon Rios, Dolores's new husband, with soft hands and hard eyes, looking at Rancho Dos Ríos the way a man looks at something he has decided belongs to him. Dolores's plan was simple and mercenary, and not even dressed up in kindness. She wanted Rosa back, not out of love, not out of guilt, not out of any feeling more complicated than greed. The girl was old enough to work. Her new husband had seen the arithmetic clearly. A pair of young hands on a ranch costs nothing if they belong to a dependent.
Señorita Vidal presented her documents. The law, she said, recognized Dolores as next of kin. Rosa must be transferred or surrendered to the orphanage in Santa Rosa, pending review. Aurelio's voice, when he answered, was so quiet and so controlled that the room itself seemed to go still around it. He had found the child alone in the desert, without water or shoes, an hour before dark. Those were not allegations, those were facts. He had witnessed them himself. Those were allegations, Señorita Vidal repeated, adjusting her spectacles. Unproven. Rosa stood in the hallway with Consuelo's arm around her, both of them very still in the cool shadow. She was not crying. She had the same expression she had worn the first night she arrived. The face of a child who has learned that the world removes things without warning and has decided, somewhere deep and quiet, that she will survive whatever comes. But Consuelo felt the small body trembling against her side, and she held it tighter, and she made a decision. That evening, after the visitors had gone to the town inn with their promises to return, Consuelo found Aurelio in the library, and she said what she had been thinking since the moment the buggy rolled up the road. She said it plainly and without decoration, because she was a plain and undecorated woman, and she knew that the moment called for clarity.
The law did not favor them as they were. He was an unmarried man, she was a housekeeper. Together they had no standing. But a married couple, a household, a family, could petition to adopt Rosa legally, and the judge in Santa Rosa was known to be a fair man, and they had a case worth making. She was asking him to marry her, not for romance, not out of any feeling other than the one they both had for the child sleeping down the hall. She was asking because Rosa needed a family, and they were the ones who were here, and they were the ones who already loved her, and that was a sufficient foundation for what she was proposing. She used the word love, and she did not hedge it. Aurelio was quiet for a long time. The clock on the mantel measured the silence. He thought of Isabel. He thought of Miguel, who had lived 2 days and been buried in the small family plot by the North Stream. He thought about the decade of emptiness and the 6 weeks that had begun to fill it. And he thought about a small girl on a horse laughing with her dark hair flying behind her and the way the ice had moved, and he said yes. They rode to Santa Rosa the next morning, all 3 of them in the best carriage, dressed carefully. Rosa wore a blue dress that Consuelo had sewn through most of the night, with white buttons and a lace collar cut from Consuelo's own Sunday blouse. She carried wildflowers she had gathered at dawn, yellow and white and burning orange, and she held them in her lap in Judge Fernando Castillo's clean whitewashed office, and sat with her back straight while the judge reviewed the papers that Licenciado Ignacio Herrera had prepared. The judge asked her if she understood what was happening. She said yes. He asked if it was what she wanted. She looked at Aurelio, who was watching her with the steady, waiting attention he gave to things that mattered most. She looked at Consuelo, who had tears on her face that she had decided were not worth the effort of wiping away. She looked at the wildflowers in her hands, things that had grown from dry and inhospitable ground without anyone tending them, that had become beautiful anyway, because that is what life does when it is stubborn enough. Yes, she said, this is what I want. The ceremony was brief, and the ring was plain gold, and when it was over, Consuelo took Aurelio's hand and held it, and he let her, and Rosa stood between them and held both their hands, and for a moment the room was simply that, 3 people holding on to each other in a whitewashed room, while sparrows argued in the fountain outside. Then the doors opened, and Dolores walked in with Ramon and Señorita Vidal, having learned somehow of the proceedings, and the room changed. Dolores spoke about her rights with the confident loudness of someone who has never been stopped before. Ramon stood behind her with his arms crossed. Señorita Vidal held her leather satchel like a shield. Licenciado Herrera let them finish. Then he asked Dolores one question, just one.
If Rosa were returned to her custody today, what would her plans for the girl be? Dolores answered honestly. She was old enough to earn her place. A girl that age could work. There was no reason she should be a charity case. The room went absolutely silent. Judge Castillo looked at Dolores for a long, unhurried moment. He set down his pen. He folded his hands. He lifted his gavel and brought it down once with the clean finality of a thing that has been decided beyond any further argument. Rosa Elena Vega was legally adopted as Rosa Elena Montoya, permanent and lawful daughter of Don Aurelio and Consuelo Reyes de Montoya of Rancho Dos Ríos. Final, irrevocable. The objections were noted and overruled. The court was adjourned. The clerk applauded. Licenciado Herrera laughed from somewhere deep in his chest. Consuelo pressed her face into Rosa's hair and wept the way you weep when something you didn't dare hope for comes true. Aurelio stood with his hand on Rosa's shoulder, and on his face, for the first time in 10 years, was the expression that people who loved him would have recognized instantly if they had been close enough to see it. It was peace, plain and complete, and long overdue. The years after that were good ones, not without difficulty. The desert is not generous, and ranching is not easy, and life has a way of presenting its bills without warning. But the house was full. Rosa grew into a young woman of remarkable intelligence and extraordinary stubbornness, Aurelio's eye for land and Consuelo's gift for people. A reader and a horsewoman, and a person of such easy, grounded confidence that strangers sometimes asked about her as if trying to identify the source of something they couldn't quite name. Aurelio and Consuelo built what they had promised each other, slowly, honestly, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and a genuine appreciation for each other's virtues, until what had begun as a practical arrangement became something that neither of them had words for, and neither of them needed words for. Rosa Elena Montoya kept her mother's rag doll on the mantel of the great house at Rancho Dos Ríos for the rest of her life. When visitors asked about it, and they did sometimes, a worn and faded thing among the silver and the photographs, she would take it down and hold it for a moment and say the same thing every time. "It is the first thing I had," she would say, "and the thing that brought me to everything else." Family is not always the thing we are born into. Sometimes it is the thing we are found by a man on a ridge with a spyglass and the sense to act on what he saw, by a woman with warm hands who knew without being told what a child needed, by a judge who listened to the one question that mattered and trusted the answer. Sometimes family is built from nothing more than the decision to stay, made by people who had every reason to turn away and chose not to. The desert looks empty. It is not empty. Beneath the dry surface, beneath the cracked earth and the long patience of the heat, there are seeds that have been waiting years for the rain that will make them bloom. Rosa Elena Vega was one of those seeds. She was found. She was watered. She became something beautiful.
And Rancho Dos Ríos, that great quiet house beside 2 rivers in the Sonora territory, was never empty again. If this story stayed with you today, if it reminded you of someone you love, or someone who found you when you needed finding, please share it with them. Stories like Rosa's deserve to travel. Subscribe to Desert Hearth so you never miss a story told from the fire. Leave us a like if this one moved you. Ring the bell and we will be here every week with another story of ordinary people doing quietly extraordinary things. The fire is always burning. Until next time, from Desert Hearth, may you always be found by the people who are meant to find you.